That was a lot of error handling. Let me now fix that error again. And in the meantime, behind the scenes, I also cleared up my Firebase storage here, and I only have two products in there which I added. A book and a shirt. I deleted all the other dummy records we added in the meantime, and now I want to fetch these products. Now we could fetch them here on this user products page, but I think the most important page to fetch the products is the shop page, this product overview screen here. There, when this screen loads, I want to fetch my products because the app simply doesn't work if I can't get my products from the server there. And I always want to have my latest products there as well, because whenever we reload that page, I simply want to see what's in the shop. So therefore here in products overview, which is that widget that renders that screen, I want to fetch products when that screen loads. Now, how can we do that? Well, generally, initState would be a great place here. We're having a stateful widget here anyways, we have a state object, and initState would run when this first gets rendered, and it would only run once. And that's the perfect scenario for fetching data. So here we could absolutely use our HTTP package and do the GET request and fetch the data and then store that in our provided container, in our provided object, and so on. The only downside with that is that we don't want to have too much logic in our widget. So putting that HTTP fetching code in this widget would technically work, but it's not the best way of doing that. We want to keep that widget lean. So the better approach is to actually move that fetching code into our class here, into our provided class, and therefore hide it from the widget. And in the widget, we can then just call a method to do the fetching. So here in the product start file in the providers folder, I'll add a future, which will yield nothing in the end. And I'll name it fetch and set products. But the name is of course totally up to you. But that's what this method should do. Now I want to use async await in there, hence I'll add the async keyword between the parameter list and the function body. And now in here, the goal is to reach out to that URL, hence I'll copy it, because of course the products are stored on that URL and we want to fetch the products from exactly the URL we used for storing them. And then in there we use the HTTP package, which I prefixed here, hence HTTP dot, which I use here, to fetch the products. So here I can now use a GET request. We used POST for storing, for adding a product. Now I can use GET for, well, fetching a product. So here I send a GET request to this URL. And now for a GET request, you need no extra configuration. Unlike a POST request, you don't have to append data. A GET request works like that. So I just get data and we're good. Now since I use async here, I can await this, wait for the response, and of course I'm interested in the response because the response will contain my data. Now this might of course fail, so we can wrap this into try catch again to do something with that error we might be getting here, and we can of course then also throw that error again in case we get one, so that we could handle it in our widget if we wanted to do that there. Now, I'll keep that leaner here and I'll not add error handling logic in the widget simply to not bloat this course module too much, but you learned how error handling logic would work and you're absolutely free to experiment with that and see how you might want to handle possible errors in this case here. I'll focus on the success case now. So here we're trying to get this response, and if we succeeded, so if we have a response, let's see what's in there, right? Let's see what we get so that we can then determine how we can actually get that response data into our list of products up there, which is of course the ultimate goal. So right now I'm just printing the response. Let's now make sure we call fetch and set products. The goal is to call that from inside products overview, and of course initState would be great here. We can use provider in here, so make sure you have provider imported. Also make sure you have your products imported. So from the providers folder, the product start file, because that's the class which has the method we want to call. And then off for the products class, context. Context is available everywhere here in our state, in the end in our state class, just like widget. And then call fetch and set products. Now let's save that and do a hot refresh here. And now what we actually see is that we get an error here. We get an error here for a reason we already saw earlier in the course. in initState, all these off-context things don't work, like modal route off-context, right? That also didn't work here, simply because the widget is not fully wired up with everything here. So therefore, we can't do that here. This won't work. And otherwise, it would be great if we wouldn't reach out to our provider of context here. This would be a great solution and a great place for fetching our products. Now, there are two ways around that. One is that you use future delayed here, which is a helper constructor to build a new future. There, you add a duration, and I'll use duration 0 to basically add no delay. And then you can add a then block, and in that function here, you could now actually reach out to your provider and do that fetching. So you could do that here, ignore the value we're getting, and you would be fine. And even though this technically also executes immediately because we have 0 duration until this code runs, so this is simply a helper constructor which creates a future which executes then after this duration passed, and this will execute immediately, but technically this is still registered as a to-do action by Dart, and it will first continue initializing the class here and the widget before it then comes back and executes this. And this will all happen immensely fast, but it orders this differently than when you directly call this code here. So this would work, but it's kind of a hack, though you can absolutely also use this approach. The other approach is an approach we used earlier already, and that is that you add the did change dependencies lifecycle method Flutter knows, and this will now run after the widget has been fully initialized, so to say, but before build ran for the first time. It will, however, unlike initState, run more often, multiple times, and not just when this gets created. So when using this approach, you should have another helper variable or property like isInit, where you check if you're running this for the first time, basically, and only execute some code if that is true, and set isInit to false thereafter so that this never runs again. And then you can put your code for fetching products in here. And then this will only run when this page first loads. So that is the alternative. Both approaches work. Both are kind of workarounds, but both are fine to use. Use whichever you prefer. By the way, this future delayed syntax, of course, would have also worked for a modal route off or for any code which depends on this off context pattern in initState. With that, if I now do a hot refresh, this loads. I still see my dummy shirts here. These are not the shirts from Firebase, but the dummy shirts. And I see instance of response. And that's, of course, coming from this print statement. So with that, we're printing that. To see what's in there, let's actually decode the body with JSON decode response.body, because that's the interesting part now. Otherwise, we just print the entire response object. I'm interested in the body, though. So let's do a full refresh here. And this will now reload that page. And with that reloaded, here we actually see what Firebase returns us. And that's a very useful output here.